quite central. So,
right.
but best of luck.
We've been watching The Crown on TV lately.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. I
Great show.
I think a lot of it is. I know some of the royal family have tried to sort of say, well, it is fiction, and you shouldn't take it too seriously. But a lot of it is based upon, it's pretty close. I would say in lots of places.
Right.
But yeah, it's certainly a very interesting production. I don't know if you've seen any episodes yet when they go to Balmoral.
Yes.
That's shot. It is shot in Scotland, but it's shot on a private estate because Balmoral looks nothing like the location they have in the series.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I got married a couple of years ago. So
lovely. Oh, great.
Castle.
Good for you. That's great.
Yeah, and it's always popping up in TV and films and stuff. And the estate itself was used for the last Bond film.
Uh-huh.
The car chases. And I'm quite a big Bond fan. And
since the last time we spoke, I watched the movie. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you liked it?
Oh yeah, very much, yeah.
Yeah. So the whole Land Rover chase, and when it flips over in the air and it's going through with the helicopters and all that sort of thing. So it's supposed to be Norway, but it's most of it shot on that estate. Oh. And I'm quite a big Bond fan, and I dragged my wife to a Bond location tour in Switzerland and Portugal, which wasn't much of a hardship for her, but it was still very much Bond, 24/7. So she's quite happy to get away with something that, the wedding and, in Scotland, something different. And she was a bit sort of bewildered that suddenly it was announced as being in the new Bond film. So by the time we had the wedding, they'd already shot everything. So we spent a week on the estate, and we just went round all the locations for a day or so, which much to mine, not so much to hers really.
Oh, that's great.
She thought she got away from it all, but it's
so what's next for the Bond movies?
Well, everyone seems to be a little bit worried. I won't say about the ending just in case somebody's watching this that hasn't seen it. But I think people think that because of Daniel Craig's gone, it's like when any Bond leaves, you think, well, where does it go next? I assume they'll just reboot it and a new chronology, as it were, and just take it from. But he's very difficult to follow. I think Daniel Craig. I think he's very, very. I think he's one of the best Bonds I think there's ever been, really.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a bunch of chats from Ian here.
Hang on.
Is it somebody you know?
Oh yeah, yes. Ian attends quite a few of my events. So hello, Ian. So yes, he says, "Good evening, Jim. Thanks for joining us this evening."
I think it looked like he said he didn't know you were such a Bond fan.
Yeah, he was saying it's been reported that the most recent series of The Crown has been more controversial. So I think as it gets set more and more
contemporary,
I think it's probably going to get a lot more press, really. And Ian just said, didn't realise that I got married in Scotland, because Ian is from Scotland and he's joined us from Scotland. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And apparently George Lazenby is his favourite Bond.
Which one? George
George Lazenby.
Which one was he?
He did a Majesty's Secret Service, the one where Bond got married.
I probably saw it, but I don't recall it off the top of my head.
Well, he only did one Bond film because he got some very bad advice not to make anymore. Because this was after Sean Connery had just left, and it was, oh well, the series will die its death and you'll be typecast, and boy were they wrong. But he walked away after one. So if you're not a big Bond fan, you might not know him, but he had the fortune of being in the best Ian Fleming novel. So it's worth a look, I'd say.
Oh.
Do you have a favourite Bond, Jim?
No, not that I can think of offhand. I did enjoy this last one very much.
Hmm.
I thought it was pretty exciting. You know, I like the I think I know of the director. I like him. I think he's quite talented.
Yes, yes, he is, isn't he? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, young guy.
yeah, Kelly Fukunaga, I think it is, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. He grew up in Berkeley, where I used to live, and he's made a number of good movies
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah, yeah, it is a wonderfully shot film.
Yeah.
Cinematography is stunning, and it's a bit more deeper and complex than some of the other Bond films, definitely.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, maybe they'll bring back that young black actress to be the new 007, wasn't she? Who in the
Yeah,
I'm remembering. Yeah.
I think she could certainly have a good spin-off film.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. Sure. That'll be exciting.
she was brilliant.
Yeah.
I don't know if Bond's going to become a bit like Star Wars, and because now Amazon owns it, that you're going to start to get the Black 007, the Moneypenny
All right.
series. I think the producers are a bit protective of it and don't want to go down that route. So I don't think you're going to end up with a Star Wars like
Yeah.
Empire. But
Right.
it'd be interesting though if they did.
Yeah.
So I think we'll probably make a start, Jim, if that's okay. I think everybody's joined us. I haven't got any messages to say anybody's had trouble logging in. No? Okay. So
Great.
yeah, so let's make a start, Jim. I wanted just to get, before we get into Jedi itself, I just wanted to get a bit more understanding of your career, some of your pre Star Wars experiences.
Oh, sure.
And the first question I wanted to ask was, how did you end up going into film business in the first place? Were you always a film lover? How did it happen?
Well, I was always a film lover, and when I was 18 or 19 and a student at University of California at Berkeley, I knew I had to find a career for myself. And my brother was at the time was working on a Robert Wise movie called The Andromeda Strain,
Mm-hmm.
and he loved movie making, and he lent me an 8mm Bolex camera. And in my freshman year, in a physics class, I made a movie as a project, and I sort of fell in love with filmmaking. I said, "Wow, this is great fun." Very interesting. It's storytelling, it's visual, it's photography, it's got all these great elements all being brought together. And so I decided that if it was a career I wanted to follow, I should try and get some practical experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent my next year at school, taking what few film classes there were. Yeah, not me. Oh, I lost your voice. You're back.
Oh, I've got you now.
Oh, good. Yeah, you went down, but I stopped hearing you for a second.
Oh, okay. Maybe there's an internet connection problem or something.
Yeah, you got me back again.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, so sorry, Jim, you were saying that you wanted to get some practical experience to get into the business.
Yeah, so the next year I followed documentary crews around and carried lights and cables and cameras and just sort of worked for free. And then the next summer, I decided I better try and find a job, and I was very lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed for a job as a gopher on American Graffiti that George Lucas directed, and that was really my first job on a feature film. And it was, as I joke, I said the magic words when I interviewed with George and his producer, who was also the producer on Star Wars and Empire, whose name was Gary Kurtz.
Yeah.
I was 19 and I went into the office and I said, "I'll work for free." And they said, "Oh no," I was lucky to be able to do that. And they said, "Oh no, that's okay. You don't have to do that. We'll pay you $10 a day." And I went, "Oh no, you don't need to." And they said, "No, we'll pay you $10." Anyway, they hired me and they wound up paying me a little bit more. And on American Graffiti, I was responsible for all of the extra picture cars.
Okay.
So that I don't know if you remember Graffiti, but there are 4 or 5 principal actors and they all have these great cars. And I was responsible for casting and then setting the background action in the streets where we shot in San Rafael, California. Excuse me. and Petaluma, California, with all the cars. And after Graffiti, the Francis Coppola was making a movie called The Conversation.
Yes.
And he had worked out a deal with the Directors Guild of America, which represents directors, production managers, assistant directors on the film side, to start a company called the Directors Company, which he created with himself and Peter Bogdanovich and Billy Friedkin. And the idea was that it was going to be a director's movie company of sorts. And he worked out a deal with the Directors Guild to hire 2 assistant director trainees for the San Francisco Bay Area. And because of my work on Graffiti and one of the other assistant directors who I worked with on Graffiti, they gave me one of those positions. So I became a DGA trainee, which was great because it enabled me to work on union movies in a production position. That DGA training program was a relatively new program back in the early 70s. And they only took people after they completed a psychological aptitude test. But I sort of got in as a bastard child through the back door.
Right.
And so I worked on The Conversation, and that's how I got into the Directors Guild. I think I was one of the youngest trainees to get in, only being 19 or 20 at the time. And then I worked on a lot of great movies early on in my career. I was very lucky. I worked on I'm going to forget all the films that I worked on back then. So I worked on The Conversation, and then I went to work on a Bob Altman movie that my brother was working on, and they needed some extra production help. So I flew down to Jackson, Mississippi to work on a movie called Thieves Like Us.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It was a really good film, fun film. And then after Thieves was over, I came back to Northern California, and they were shooting the Streets of San Francisco TV show with Carl Malden and Michael Douglas. And I went in to introduce myself to the production manager, who's a man named Dick Gallagly. It was a Quinn Martin production. They were very famous back in the 60s and 70s. They did Hawaii Five-0 and Streets of San Francisco and a bunch of other successful kind of cops TV shows. And I said, the production manager, look, I'm here. And if you have any days where you need some extra help, please call me. I'd be happy to come in and help. And he said, great, you start Monday. And I went, what? He said, yeah, you start Monday. I want you full time. Well, being a good production manager, he realized that, here I was, cheap help for an LA based company shooting in San Francisco that he didn't have to pay for a hotel room and food. It was like, boy, what a deal.
Yes.
So, and I was like, huh? I didn't think I wanted to work on TV, but then I thought about it and I went, well, why not? It would be a great way to get my days in as a trainee so that I could, work my way up the ladder to become a second assistant director and then a first assistant director. And TV is very quick and very interesting.
Yeah.
Also, it was a great chance because Carl Malden was the star. And Carl is an incredible actor. And it took me a while to realize back then just how great he was and how many wonderful movies he'd worked on. And then the other star was Michael Douglas, who I still know to this day, who was a great actor and became a great producer. And we worked with a lot of great directors on the TV show. And it was funny that there was a director at the time whose name was Dickie Donner, who went on to direct all the Superman movies. But he was directing episodes of the Streets of San Francisco. And then the other fun stuff about Streets was that each week there were these great guest stars who came onto the show. And I got to meet all of these great actors back then who would come on to do guest role appearances. I got to work with Ida Lupino, who was a very famous actress and one of the first female movie directors of the times back in the 40s and 50s, and a wonderful person. And then the other person who is a great treat, through my career, I've gotten to meet a bunch of actors from time to time who were, like great stars that I never thought I would meet. I, was still, and, am to this day from time to time, starstruck by the people that I meet, although I know that, they're all just people and whatnot. But I've met a few people who were icons in movie history and in the movie business. Carl certainly being one of them. But the other person was Sam Jaffe. And when I was young growing up, I used to watch, I grew up outside of New York City, and there was a movie channel called WOR TV, Channel 9, out of New York. And every Saturday afternoon, they played great old movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And one of my favorites was Gunga Din. And Gunga Din was played by Sam Jaffe.
Right.
And it's a wonderful movie. And but Sam Jaffe showed up to work on Streets as a guest star, and it was like, oh my God, I'm like meeting my icon from when I was a kid of 9 or 10 years old. Here's Sam Jaffe. I got to meet Gunga Din. What a treat.
Yeah.
The other person that comes to mind who I met like that. I mean, I've worked with a lot of movie stars, but the other person who I met was Henry Fonda, and that was really a great treat. I was working on Coming Home years later that Hal Ashby directed. With Jane Fonda and John Voight and Bruce Stern, and Henry came on the set one day, and I remember meeting him in person, and what a treat it was to meet, to meet Henry Fonda. It was like, wow, this is really cool. So I've never kind of lost that, slightly open-eyed, starstruck quality about certain people that I've met from time to time. I had that same feeling when I worked with Warren Beatty for a little while.
Yeah.
On Dick Tracy before the movie was made. And that was a treat working with Warren. So, there are lots of people like that. They're like, like Hollywood royalty kind of, so to speak. We were talking about The Crown earlier, and this is like, Hollywood's version of The Crown. You get to work with some of these people who are just these well-known icons. But earlier in my career, I was very lucky. So I worked with Robert Altman. I did a season on the Streets of San Francisco TV show. And then I, after the conversation, Sam Peckinpah called Coppola's office, and they recommended me to take Peckinpah location scouting in San Francisco for a movie he was planning called The Killer Elite, with Jimmy Caan and Robert Duvall and Gig Young. And, it was just a kind of a Peckinpah CIA adventure movie. And so I and a couple of young guys, we drove Peckinpah all around San Francisco scouting locations for The Killer Elite, which he came back and made like a year later. And I had then finished 2 years on the Streets of San Francisco TV show and was now a second AD. I had sort of gotten my days behind me. And I went to work on The Killer Elite with Sam. And then later that year, I worked with John Cordy, who was a great TV director, on a TV movie called Farewell to Manzanar, which was about the Japanese internment camps during the Second World War. And John is now a neighbor of mine out where I live in West Marin. And John was indirectly responsible for helping me get my first job on American Graffiti. It's like, people looking for work in the movie business, I always say it's like, it's polite persistence. And I bothered John for months to meet him, introduce myself, because he lived in the Bay Area, and he always said, no. And then one day, and I joke with him about this, one day he said, okay, come over. And I came over and I had a meeting with him, and he opened the door, and he was on the inside and I was on the outside, and he didn't invite me in even. But he said like some magic words to me. He said, there's this guy named George Lucas, and he's making a movie called American Graffiti over in San Rafael. You ought to give him a call. I went, okay. And I drove home and picked up the phone and immediately found the production office. I think it was under Lucasfilm. This is all well before cell phones or, computers, or it was 1972, any of that stuff. And I spoke to a woman on the phone, and her name was Bunny Alsip, who was Gary Kurtz's assistant, and who years later, I a million stories I could tell. Years later, I said to Bunny, why me? I just picked up the phone and called you. What was it about me that you said, yeah, we're looking for somebody. Can you come in tomorrow? It was like, yeah, sure. And I came right in, and then I got the job. And then I later worked with Bunny on Empire. And Bunny then later worked for me when I was a producer for a little bit. And she, we were, great friends. But why me? She said, oh, I like the sound of your voice over the telephone. It's like, who knows? It's, those things happen.
Yeah.
And then later, Bunny passed away a couple of years ago, and I went to a memorial, and at the memorial were Gary Kurtz's daughters, who I had known since they were little kids, but who are now, young women in their 30s and late 30s and 40s. And I remember saying to one of the sisters, that had Bunny not liked the sound of my voice on the telephone, I never would have worked on Empire or Jedi. Or nor would, one of the girls now who is working, the younger sister, Tiffany, or is it Melissa? I get them mixed up, I'm sorry, was working for Illumination Entertainment on all the Despicable Me movies as an editor. And that happened because of my relationship with one of the producers on that movie, who I helped get into the movie business at the time, many, many years ago. She used to work for me. And it was all of these, interconnections of things and people and other people who I hired, who then went on to win Academy Awards working for Bob Zemeckis or Steven Spielberg or all of these situations. And she said to me, she said, Jim, it's very funny. All roads lead to Bunny. Is what she said. And it's very true that, life and careers and of these things is like a pinball game. You drop your pinball in the machine and pull it back and let it go. And depending on what bumpers you hit that then hit other things that, it's like, that's the way life happens. It's such random serendipity to it all. So anyway, that's an aside. So I worked with Bob Altman, and then I worked on Bound for Glory with Hal Ashby. And then I was an assistant director on Close Encounters of the Third Kind with Steven Spielberg. And then again with Hal Ashby on Coming Home. And then I became eligible to be a first assistant director, which I did on, I was first AD on Corvette Summer with a director named Matthew Robbins. They were a writing directing team of Barwood and Robbins, Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, who are probably better known, Matthew, for directing Dragon Slayer, that he wrote with Hal. And then I'll get back to that in a minute. It was their first picture, and Mark Hamill was the star of Corvette Summer. And this was after Star Wars. And I'd always kept in touch with George and Gary over the years. And I remember in late April, early May of 1970, I was down in LA, and I went over to Universal to say hi to Gary, just to check in, because he'd always sort of been a mentor to me. And I always would, from time to time, get his advice on my career. And he took out this book of still photos, huge still photos, like, 16 by 20, a big publicity book of images from Star Wars. And he said, here, this is our movie. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. And he showed me these images from Star Wars. And it was like, oh my God, look at this. Because they were finished pictures, images taken from the film after visual effects were added and things like that. And the picture was just mind blowing, looking at this movie that was about to come out. And I remember the first weekend it came out, I, went and saw it in the theater at an early morning, 11 a.m. show. And I was just, gobsmacked on how great it was. It was just wonderful. I just really just loved it and went back and saw it a few more times. Because Star Wars is such a great movie. It still is. And so after Star Wars, that was in 70. 70 came out?
Star Wars 77.
70, oh yeah, I'm getting all my days mixed up. Thank you, Philip. Thanks for helping. 77, so worked on Corvette Summer, worked with Phil Kaufman on the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is another really good movie. And then as Body Snatchers was winding down, Gary called me and asked me if I would come to work on Empire as his assistant. He needed an assistant producer. And I went, yeah, sure. Like, how often do you get a chance to go work on the sequel of the second largest grossing movie that's ever been made? Not to mention that it was not only commercially successful, but it was a wonderful movie as well. So I went to work on Empire. And I set up and was the general manager of Industrial Light and Magic on Empire, and was also, as I think you know from our previous conversation, was responsible for the Norwegian unit, all of the Hoth work, exterior Hoth work that we did on the glacier in Norway. And then after Empire, George actually recommended me to go work with Larry Kasdan on Body Heat, but there was a Writers Guild strike and the movie got delayed. And anyway, I didn't produce that movie, but came back to work as a co-producer on Return of the Jedi, which I did, so that was, I was very lucky in my early career, remarkably lucky to work with these great directors, with George, with Coppola, with Bob Altman, with Hal Ashby and Sam Peckinpah and Steven Spielberg and Phil Kaufman. And then after that, I developed a bunch of movies. The nature of the movie business is you can often develop movies that aren't made. But I got opportunities to work with Warren Beatty and Volker Schlondorf, who directed The Tin Drum, for people who don't know his name, which is a wonderful movie. With George Miller of the Mad Max world. We were going to try to do a picture together that didn't quite work out. And lots of different directors that I met along the way that I had, with Carol Ballard of the Black Stallion, group, all these great directors. So it was a real, a real treat.
Do you have a favorite director that you worked with? Or do you have a favorite director that you ever worked with?
I like all the directors I work, I like some more than others, but they were, everyone was unique and different. And had a different style and, whatnot. The favorite directors is really sort of more about, personal relationships, and how I got to know them and how I contributed to the movie making. And, I like most of them, some more than others.
Yeah.
I really like Hal Ashby quite a bit, and Phil Kaufman a lot, and learned a lot and enjoyed, always enjoyed working with George, except I only worked with George on one movie where he was a director, which is Graffiti, but he was a producer.
Yeah.
On Empire and Jedi. And always enjoyed working with Matthew Robbins. We tried to do movies together later, but enjoyed Corvette Summer Experience. Peckinpah was a crazy man, an alcoholic, unfortunately. But when he was sober, he was, great director to work with. Watching Altman work was a treat. Well, I'm sure I'm forgetting people.
We had an audience question come in. Someone's got a big fan of the conversation.
Oh, good.
Any particular memories of that production that would be interesting?
Well, it was such a unique movie for the time, because I think it was one of the first movies, and you can credit this to Walter Murch, where they use sound design to really fill out the artistic production scope of the picture, because it's all about sound. It's all about Gene Hackman, who plays this bugger, who records people surreptitiously. And it was just so remarkable how Walter and Francis weaved this soundtrack of people's voices into the movie. So that in itself was really quite beautiful and stuff. And it was I think it's one of Gene Hackman's best performances as well. You know, because he's playing it. I think he's playing a different character that you don't see him play very often. And then the other thing that was fun about it is that you look at the cast who was in that movie at the time. It was Cindy Williams, who later went on to become a big TV star, and Harrison Ford was in it again. You know, who I had met on American Graffiti, and he was in it. And Bobby Duvall was in it, and Gene and John Cazale and Terry Garr. You know, it was a great casting. Francis always worked with often worked with Fred Roos, who had a great eye for casting young actors and actresses who were very talented and helping them launch their careers, which he did with Harrison and Cindy and Fred Forrest and all of these different people. So yeah, the conversation was really quite a remarkable movie. You know, and interesting. You know, from a strictly production point of view, it was a very cold December in San Francisco when we shot in Union Square. So I remember being outside freezing, quite a bit, but certainly not anywhere near as bad as Norway.
No,
but still unique, and a great treat to watch, to watch Francis work. It's always a treat to watch all these different directors work with their cast, and how they build their movies together and how things develop on set.
Yeah,
that was great fun, and I was still quite young at the time, so I was still learning about that.
I mean, when you were getting into film business, was it your goal to become a director, or were you fairly flexible as to where you wanted to go?
No, it was my goal initially to become a director. Which is why I was always so interested working with all these different directors. For me, that was a great treat.
So how did you feel about being asked to sort of essentially head up ILM for Empire Strikes Back? I assume you didn't really have much of a visual effects.
I had worked on Close Encounters, so I was versed in the visual effects movie making.
Yeah.
And at the time, we shot Close Encounters in '76, and on Close Encounters is a huge amount of visual effects. So I knew quite a bit about making movies with visual effects and how to integrate the visual effects into the actual production.
Yeah.
As far as the production process and the actual principal photography, I didn't necessarily know about all of the different aspects of visual effects from the post-production point of view. So at least having that information, gave me some value. And what happened was that I wasn't quite sure how my job would develop, but it turned out that Gary asked me to set ILM up and to invite all of the guys who had worked on the first Star Wars up to San Francisco to work at ILM, which was a big move for all of them, because the goal behind ILM at the time was not only to make The Empire Strikes Back, but also to turn it into an ongoing facility for making more Lucasfilm movies and making outside movies. I used to have these conversations with George back then, which was, the plan was in 1980 or 78, 79. There were great dreams and plans, and the plan for ILM was, for Star Wars, was to make 3 trilogies and 3 separate stories. And we used to talk about that. And the 3 trilogies were, that there were, Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi, which became 4, 5, and 6. And then to tell stories 1, 2, and 3, which he then later made, and then to tell 7, 8, and 9. And then beyond that, 10, 11, and 12 were going to be the Wookiee story and the droid story, and I forget what the other one was. So a lot of that sort of came about in different ways, except that 1, 2, and 3 weren't made until, from 83 until the late 90s. It took a long time for George to come around and finally direct all of those movies. And plus the visual effects changed radically from analog to digital. But when we were making Empire and Jedi, it was all, analog stuff that we were doing, but at the same time, introducing and advancing motion control computer camera equipment was allowing people to, move the camera quite a bit, which was great, which is stuff that we did on Close Encounters quite a bit with Doug Trumbull's Reagan outfit, which was very similar to what the guys had over at ILM. It was a pretty small visual effects business back then.
Yeah.
And, so the goal was to, move into an empty warehouse building and turn it into Industrial Light and Magic and build all of these things. And what happened was, on Empire was that Gary wanted me to come over to England and be there with the production. And so I had to hire another production supervisor to kind of take over at ILM in San Rafael when we had built the facility and brought all these guys up from LA. And I actually hired Dick Gallagly, who was the production manager on the Streets of San Francisco TV show. Right. Because it seemed to me that it was good to bring a production sensibility to a visual effects house as far as kind of tightening the protocols and procedures and financial end of things, and et cetera, et cetera. And so Dick came in, and as we got into production on Empire, I went to London in like November of 79, 78. And we shot in Norway in February of 79, if I recall. And after we were done shooting in Norway, where everything went way over, schedule because of the weather. But we delivered some, beautiful, beautiful shots and sequences. And I came back to London, and Gary said to me, I want you to go back to San Rafael, and we're having trouble at ILM. I'm worried that they've got too much work and it's not well organized, and I want you to go back and run point on that. And I got back there, and after a while, Dick said, you don't need me anymore. You're here. I'm going to leave because I'm really not very happy here. I'm a live action guy, and this is a completely different animal than what I'm used to. I'm not used to these post-production guys. Yeah. I'm used to, going out and shooting on locations, and this is not what I do best. So he left and I took over. And, we finished up on Empire, and it was quite an undertaking. Well, I don't know if did I answer your question or?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah.
I go off on tangents sometimes, Philip. I'm sorry. You have to, you need to steer me back in. Just interrupt me and let me know.
No, I think it's quite nice for us to go off on a few tangents, because it takes us into really good territory. So that's fine. Sure. I did have one question come through. What skills do you need to be a good film producer? What does it take to be a good film producer?
You to be a good film producer, you need to be able to recognize good story. Most important of all, and what will make a good movie. You need to be incredibly passionate about the story, and you need to be able to convey that passion to other people. Particularly the people who are putting up the money and the actors who are interested in working on the movie and on the story and working with whoever the director is. And you need to be able to keep a 20,000 foot view of the production,
right,
to know what's important and what's not important. And you need to be able to realistically schedule, understand the filmmaking process, which it's very interesting. There are a lot of producers who don't know how to do that. They tend to come out of being agents or managers or lawyers, and they love movie making, but they don't understand the actual physical process of movie making and what's involved.
Yeah.
And I think really the first most important thing is knowing what a great story is, or getting a sense of what makes a very compelling story to turn into a movie. But I've got to say that the whole movie business is changing now completely. And I don't think it'll ever be the same. I think it's evolving, right before our eyes, and radically evolving. because of the pandemic and what the pandemic did to closing movie theaters down and keeping people out of movie theaters. And that the television streaming, the streaming companies now, all of them, Netflix, Disney, HBO Max. I mean, where do people see their movies? I don't go to the movie theater anymore. I haven't been to a movie theater in 2 or 3 years. But that's just me, because I'm not going to go to a movie theater. I'm older and I don't want to, catch COVID. So I won't go to a movie theater. The experience of going to movie theaters also, because I'm spoiled, is not as pleasant as it used to be as when I was younger. Because as I, kind of matured in the movie business, I got spoiled by going to see screenings at Lucasfilm or at the Motion Picture Academy or these great big beautiful, theaters with wonderful prints and great sound systems and comfortable seats and no popcorn and no hot dogs and no candy and no wrappers and people not using cell phones and especially no coming attractions, which drive me crazy. The movie starts at 8 o'clock screening of something and I'm sitting in the theater and I'm watching 15 minutes of advertising and coming attractions. It's like, get me out of here. I just don't have the patience for that anymore. I just want to see the movie. And so, now, at home, we've got 50 and 60 inch, beautiful 4 and 8K resolution television sets to watch movies by. And yes, I know it's not the same if it's a Star Wars movie or some other great movie. It's wonderful to go see it in a theater the way it's meant to be seen. But I could, I could do without the crowds. I happen to enjoy watching movies at home. At my leisure and not having to, well, I'm in my 60s now, so it's not a problem. But when I was younger and going to the movies became expensive when my wife and I were raising a family. For any of you out there, it's like, all right, let's go to the movies. What do we do with the kids? Particularly young kids who are like, 0 to 11, 12 years old who you can't leave alone. So it's like, get a babysitter, go out to all of a sudden, theater tickets, popcorn, it's like $100 evening. It's an expensive piece of entertainment just to go see a movie. So it's kind of difficult that way. So I think that the business, the cinematic storytelling business is changing as well. And I mean, this is something that I notice, very much. And in some senses, although it didn't necessarily start with MTV, a lot of it kind of advanced that way. People have a far advanced cinematic grammar now than they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And I won't say it all started then, because you can go back to, the 1920s when Ziga Vertov made The Man with the Movie Camera and get a sense of montage and editing, which is just beautiful. And, bring it up into today. I mean, there are very few static shots anymore in movies. The camera's always moving. It's always moving, and you can tell a story in quick cuts, bang, 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 and the audiences understand it. I used to try to show to my son, who's now 30, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was like, it was too slow. It's too slow for him now. There's nothing kinetic about it. It's like if you were to go back and compare because I know you're a fan, the early Bond movies, to To Live and Let Die. You've got these different filmmaking styles that people, the younger people are understand immediately. They recognize, shots and images and the stories points that they convey very quickly. It's very fast, these understandings. You don't need to do a whole lot to convey story points.
Hmm.
And so I think that that's, also true of what we see on TV these days. I mean, some of my favorite movies are the Bourne movies. I love the Bourne movies, the
Yeah.
Bourne Identity, Bourne Ultimate, and that Paul Greengrass style of filmmaking. It's just, it's completely compelling. Well, you couldn't have done that 20 years ago. People wouldn't have understood what you were doing. They wouldn't have been able to follow along, or maybe 25 years ago. But now it's all very commonplace. And I just think it's great. And so I think that cinema as a storytelling art form is changing,
Hmm.
and it's very compelling. Which is not to say that there's not a place for um, slower movies in a sense of the kind of stories that you're telling.
Hmm.
Um, but it's people are very um, you know, very open to these different cinematic styles. So, for example, I watched Don't Look Up a
Yeah.
couple of weeks ago, which I loved. I loved it. Some people, well, I got different, but I'm a big Adam McKay fan. I think his stuff is great.
Yeah.
I like his sense of humor. I like his filmmaking very much, and I thought Don't Look Up was great. I thought they did a great job editorially. I mean, it's funny. If I'm not mistaken, the guy who is the editor is a guy whose name is Charlie Corwin. I may have his name wrong, but I went to school with him at Berkeley, and we
Oh,
both
wow.
studied film and filmmaking classes
Hmm.
back then. And I haven't spoken to him in a million years, but I don't even know if he'd still remember me or not. But I remember him. I remember he was very, anyway, back then I thought he was a rather odd guy.
Right.
Very, very odd guy. I don't know if he still is. I'd have to watch some YouTube movie of him being interviewed or something to see if he's still, but obviously he's a wonderful editor. He's done, don't Look Up I thought it was, beautifully edited movie. I just liked the whole movie. I just thought it was very, very funny.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best films of last year, definitely.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah, and so, but so the style, that particular style. So what am I? So how do you make it in filmmaking? My brother used to have this picture of Bob Altman that he got from Bob, which is a picture of Bob, just like headshot, and underneath it said, "It's tough to make it in filmmaking."
Hmm.
That was the quote, and it's very true. So back to what does it take to be a good producer? It's like what George always used to say about movies: story, story, story. It's all story, story, story. It's all about characters, and you can take the most brilliant, beautiful movie, and if you don't care about the characters, you've got nothing. So you have to care about your characters and what's happening to them. You've got to be, you've got to like reach out from the screen and hook your viewers into it so they care about what's happening with the characters. So that's critical, and so it's critical to recognize good screenwriting and good storytelling. First and foremost. Then it's a question of putting the pieces together, and it's a question of understanding the finances. And then the other thing I'll say is about movie making is that Hi, Philip.
Oh, hi Jim. I was just writing you an email.
Hey guys, I'm sorry. I think my internet went out.
That's okay. I was having trouble with my internet earlier, so I thought it might have been my side, but
I think it was me because I checked and it was down for a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So apologies to your guests. Did they all stay on the line with you?
Oh yeah, but they're still here. Yeah, no harm done.
So I was talking about producing.
Yeah.
So the point, this is like a master's class in producing.
Yeah.
So the point that I wanted to make was that there are all these aspects to producing a movie. So you've got to find the material, you've got to attract the talent, your directors, your actors. In addition to that, you've got to attract the great craftspeople who come on with you, your director of photography, your production designer, your editor, your costume designer, really the key people, the visual effects people, the visual effects house in making the movie, depending on the story that you're telling. So the different aspects of it is you've got, you got pre-production, you've got production when you actually make the movie, where you're trying to make it as good as possible. I'll get back to that in a moment. Yeah. You've got post-production where you take all the elements and put them together, editorial. And post-production sound, you can't overlook the value of great sound. And I can go back to that in a second and tell a story too.
Yeah.
And then after the movie's done, you've got to sell it. You've got to market it and release it and publicize it and distribute it. And that in itself is an equally significant and important part of the movie making that you always have to keep in mind along that whole thread line of the production. Who's going to see it? How am I going to distribute it? How much money is going to go into publicizing it and marketing it? What are those materials going to look like? And then after the movie opens, it's, the question of, hopefully trying to get good reviews and get those reviews and words of mouth out there. And today with social media, there's a whole new skill set that people have in, releasing and distributing movies, because there's so many people who get their information through social media these days, not through the traditional channels that were around when I was growing up, which was basically, radio and TV and coming attractions in the theaters and stuff like that. Everything's all on social media now. And so many people, stream their movies at home and they get to hear about new things, through social media, through the people that they follow.
Yeah.
And different websites that they follow. So it's a pretty complicated business, and it's very difficult. But the underlying aspect is always story. And then the thing about production is that it also takes a certain amount of knowledge of knowing in any movie that you're making, well, what's important and what's not important.
Yeah.
What are the critically important, like that I would call hinge scenes in any given movie, which is the stuff that you can't tell a story without. I haven't got that sequence, I don't have a movie. It's so important. There's so many times that I've been on, shooting with directors, and more so with younger directors than older directors, because the older directors realize this, that you get on a particular location and you say to the director, don't fuck around with the little stuff. Let's get to the most important scene on this location that we need to tell the story of the movie. Give yourself time to do that. Whether it's, a dramatic conflict between two characters, three characters, whatever it is, where something really significant to the movie is happening. It's like the bridge between Act 1 and Act 2, or 2 and 3, or as opposed to them kind of dicking around with little stuff that doesn't mean anything, that could wind up on the cutting room floor, as opposed to those scenes that are absolutely critical to the telling of the story. That you either the big reveals, the big plot points, any of those things. Those are critically important, and you have to allow to schedule for that. You need a sensitivity to the filmmaking process to be able to do that. So, I produced a movie called Warning Sign.
Yeah.
And we made it at Fox, and it's actually a pretty good movie. I forgot to mention it earlier. It stars Sam Waterston and Kathleen Quinlan and Yaphet Kotto. We made it in 1985, and it's a story about an accident in a gene splicing laboratory.
Right.
Where the local community thinks that they're doing agrogenetics, but they're actually involved in germ warfare. And the problem was that they're in the germ warfare lab, which is this highly contained, controlled, they call the P4 laboratory because of containment procedures. There's an accident and the bug gets loose, and it's germ warfare, and people start getting sick. And the nature of this particular piece of genetic engineering was that when people get infected, you don't have to kill your enemy, they kill themselves. They kill each other because it infected the rage center of the brain. So everybody goes crazy, they get rageful, and they all kill each other. So it's like, why kill your enemy? They'll do it for you. But the problem was there was no antidote. And so the story is about having a building and sealing it off, and the people on the outside can't get in, and the people on the inside can't get out, and there's chaos and havoc everywhere. It's particularly prescient movie because of what's happening with the pandemic, because it's like a pandemic story. Don't let the pandemic out. You can't, because we can't stop it. And so I would, hey, I'm the producer. I'd recommend that anybody listening go out and rent Warning Sign on Amazon. It's a lot of fun. It's really a fun movie. It's not, not a great movie, but it's a roller coaster ride. Grab a bucket of popcorn, sit down and, rent it, and, you can get it at Amazon Prime, and, and enjoy the movie. It's, a couple hours, and Kathleen Quinlan is brilliant. She's just wonderful in the movie. She's the woman stuck inside, and Sam Waterston is the sheriff who's on the outside, who can't get in to get to his wife. And then there's the government guy who wants to close it off and let the disease run its course and let everybody die. And it's a fun movie, and it's very, very fast clip. So, but what's interesting about that movie from a producer point of view, so I was working with a first-time director. It was Hal Barwood, who is writer-producer, who wrote and produced Dragon Slayer, and he and Matthew together wrote Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars and MacArthur, and this was Hal's first outing as a director. So what did I tried to surround Hal with as many technically brilliant people as I could find to help him make the movie. So we hired Henry Bumstead, who worked on Hitchcock movies, to be the production designer. We hired Robert Lawrence, who was the editor on Spartacus with Kubrick, to be the editor. We hired Dean Cundy, who did all of the Bob Zemeckis Back to the Future movies, and Roger Rabbit, and all of Bob's movies, to be the director of photography. And I tried to surround Hal with all of these really wonderful people to help him make what was at the time, a low budget studio movie, and make it better and make it great. And it worked really well. And because I knew from having worked on the Star Wars movies and having learned on The Conversation how important sound was, we hired a sound designer whose name was Alan Splett, who's now passed away some years ago, but Alan was the sound designer on Amadeus. And because I couldn't work with Ben Burt because Ben was busy doing other stuff, I knew Alan would do a great job. And so what Alan did is that if you watch the movie and you turn up the sound, you'll see what a brilliant soundtrack there is. And the soundtrack to a movie is not just the music, but it's the sound effects that go in to make the movie, give it a whole new aura outside of, the visual experience of what you're seeing. And it's something that it kind of takes a trained ear to understand and appreciate. How to really kind of, take something beyond the scope of just the frame and the image of what you're looking at, because the sound adds this whole other dimension of, whether it's, footsteps echoing in a corridor or machines, humming in the background. And, you take a look at Star Wars, it's like when the laser swords go, and they're like echoing, together. It like gives this whole new feeling. And you sit in a theater at home, if you've got surround, you go, it really adds to the sensory experience of filmmaking. So it's kind of important to know, as a producer, to know all of that stuff and understand it. So it's a pretty complicated business.
Yeah, sounds it.
Yeah.
I had a question come in. Having both worked with Spielberg and George Lucas, what were their main different ways of working? What do they have in common as filmmakers?
George is a first and foremost like a great editor. He understands the editorial process and how to, cut scenes and put them together and how to tell your story that way. They're very different people because George is very shy and quiet, and he's not a three-ring circus leader on a movie set. So it's a very kind of different environment. And he also is not, he's pretty quiet with his actors as well. Stephen is the P.T. Barnum of filmmaking. Stephen is just an absolute genius. when it comes to filmmaking. And he's also a genius about film history and other movies and how to do things and how to move the camera. If you watch a, you watch a, watch a Spielberg movie, watch Raiders, watch, any of Steven's movies, the way he moves the camera around, he's just remarkable. He's just one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. George, on the other hand, is a great producer, a great storyteller, and I wouldn't necessarily say that his greatest skill set is as a director. I think he's as a filmmaker, he's a great filmmaker.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's very different than Steven is. Steven knows how to, and I try to say this fondly, jerk a tear out of somebody.
Yeah.
I don't think George knows how to do that. The actors always used to make fun of working with George. Steven's great with his actors. He's like, right in there with them. Steven's movies are just wonderful. It's just great to, I enjoy all his movies. It's like there are these telltale, camera movement shots. The way he sets stuff up. It's just kind of brilliant filmmaking. And George's stuff is very, very different. How many movies has George has directed? Far fewer movies than Steven. And I think that Steven gets better performances out of his actors.
Yeah.
Than George does as well. But I think that they're just different people. But they're great friends. They're really great buddies.
Because Spielberg was the original choice for Return of the Jedi, wasn't he, to direct? I believe at one point.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't comment on that. That may have been, but I don't think that Steven. I'm not surprised that he wouldn't want to do it because it's it's George's movies.
Yeah.
So that's probably why he never wouldn't want to do that, and he had his own slate of pictures that he wanted to go make. At that point, and he was working, and between Empire and Jedi, he was working on Raiders.
Oh yeah, yeah.
First Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah.
And I forget what movies he directed between the first Raiders and the second Raiders, but I'm sure there were a few that came in between.
Oh yeah, yeah, because I heard that it was George Lucas who Steven Spielberg was George's first choice, but of course, whether Steven was ever interested, of course, another matter.
Right.
But I hear it couldn't happen because George fell out with the Directors Guild over Empire and a few other. And that made Steven Spielberg not possible because of, I take it, the union regulations and things like that.
Right. No, it's very true.
So again, with Return of the Jedi, it's George financing it entirely out of his own pocket, just like with Empire and predominantly Star Wars. So I assume again that the budgets are reasonably tight compared to a normal, a big sequel. So it's, there wasn't a huge. I think it was made for less than Empire, if I'm not mistaken.
No, Empire was less expensive than Jedi was.
Yeah.
Jedi was because it was 3 years later, and there were more American locations, and I don't recall the budget on Jedi, but I think I'm sure it was more money than Empire was at the time.
Did it stay more in budget? Because I know Empire did sort of spiral a little bit.
Yes, it did. Yes. Yeah, I don't think there were as many, if any, surprises when we were shooting Jedi. It was sort of more controllable.
Yeah.
In that sense, we kind of knew, it was a better oiled machine. And another producer came in, Howard Kazanjian came in, and Gary left, and Howard was now the producer of the movie, and he was, watching the money very closely, how it was being spent and whatnot. And at the time, Lucasfilm had become a bigger company, and I think there were more funds available. It had become much more robust than when Empire was created. There was a lot of money that came in from Empire. You know, and as the Lucasfilm grew and developed, there was more money coming in from the ancillary markets of toys and book publishing and, you know, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, a huge amount of money coming into Lucasfilm. So I don't think the funding was as difficult a proposition at the time.
Right. I believe originally there was some, in terms of story, a bit of a conflict between Lawrence Kasdan and George in terms of whether Han Solo would die in the third act of the film. That sort of. Were you aware of those kind of sort of creative sort of, not tensions but discussions?
Well, I think that as I recall, what happened is they wasn't sure if Harrison was coming back for Jedi or not. And so that's why they froze him in Empire. You know, you kind of have to get rid of one of your characters and like, well, let's get rid of him and maybe he'll just stay frozen and he won't come back again. So I think that was like one of the, you know, story conceits on how to deal with that.
Yeah.
You know, we froze him because we don't know if he's going to come back again and, you know, reprise his role or not.
Yeah, it's a good safety, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you got a frozen character. Let's just leave him frozen.
Yeah, you don't pay him that way, do you? But
no, certainly not. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Gary Kurtz was not involved with Jedi. What was that again because of some of the production issues on Empire? Just he felt like he needed to walk away from it, or
I think that you know, the best way to put it is that their producing, directing, creative partnership suffered on Empire, and George felt it was time to bring another producer in to work on the next movie. And so that's how Howard came in. Have you seen Howard's new book? Howard has a new book out.
No, I wasn't aware he had one, no.
Yeah, I think it's on Amazon now. John Rensler wrote it for him.
Yeah.
And it's all about Howard and his career, and I haven't seen it yet, but it you know, there might be something in there about how he came. Howard and George went to USC together, and they knew each other for a long time. And Howard had worked with a lot of very good directors.
Yeah.
As well, and you know, I think that George respected Howard's producing chops because Howard at that point, before Jedi, had produced the sequel to American Graffiti. He produced more American Graffiti. And then I think after that, he didn't work on the first Raiders, but he worked on the second Raiders.
Yeah.
I recall, which was, I think the second Raiders was after Jedi.
Yeah, 84.
Yeah, right, if I'm not mistaken.
So Howard was quite a good producer to work with from your point of view and the crew.
Oh yeah, I liked working with Howard. Yeah, Howard, he's a knowledgeable guy.
So then, how did Robert Watts fit in? Because you're both credited as co-producers on the film.
Robert was sort of the live action UK producer for all of the movies, and I sort of handled the US side of production when there was production, and all of the post-production and visual effects. And that was sort of the split. More true on Empire and Jedi. I just stayed around for the production, and after production was over, I left because after Empire, although George wanted me to stay on and run ILM, I didn't want to keep running a visual effects facility. And so I brought in a man named Tom Smith to run ILM. And then Tom took over running ILM during Jedi because I was with the producing unit the whole time. And so during post-production, ILM was pretty much set up. And so Howard was there, and the two other sort of associate producers at the time, Mickey Herman and Louis Friedman, were staying on. And I was like, it didn't really seem like I had to be there. And I had an opportunity to go off and produce a movie with Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood that we worked on, but we never quite got off the ground.
Right. Yeah.
For lots of reasons. It was a great time travel movie.
Hmm.
It was almost like a precursor to Terminator. It was kind of a similar story about somebody from the future who comes back to the present,
Hmm.
to fix something that so won't have effect on the future. Great story. But we kind of, typical movie business. We were working with Alan Ladd, who was running a company called the Ladd Company at Warner Brothers, and they had put a lot of money into the Right Stuff that Phil Kaufman had directed.
Hmm.
And the Right Stuff didn't do well when it was released. And because of that, our picture got grounded.
Right.
We weren't able to get it set up at another studio, unfortunately.
Hmm.
But that's another part of producing. Had I known then what I know now, we would have made the movie.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like anything, isn't it?
Yeah, the story behind that was that it was going to be my first job as a producer, and the Ladd Company said, "We need a partner. You have to find somebody else to come in with 50% of the money."
Hmm.
And Steven sent us to Universal to talk to Lou Wasserman and Sid Sheinberg, who was it Lou? Yeah, I think that's it. Who were running Universal at the time. And I came in with a budget of like $16 million, and they told me to get it down to 14.
Hmm.
I didn't know how to do it,
Yeah.
So, but what I know now that I didn't know then was I should have said, okay, and just go forward,
Yeah.
that there's, because I learned later when I went to work at the studios that, that the studios will tell the filmmakers that they're budgeting 18, but in their internal budgets, they'll have 22. Because everybody's covering their ass every step of the way.
Hmm.
And it's really something I should have known from having worked with Steven, because when we were making Close Encounters, I remember having a production meeting with Steven and the assistant director, who was a guy named Chuck Myers, and Clark Palo, who was the production manager. I was the second AD. And we brought the production board into Steven's office. And Columbia, we were about to start shooting in a week or two, and Columbia said, "We're not going to start shooting unless you can take 2 days out of the schedule." It's kind of like ridiculous, but they said it anyway. And we went into Steven and we said, "Steven, we don't know where to find 2 days. What do we do?" And Steven physically picked up the production board, which is a board of strips that people use to schedule a movie. It's like you've got 5 scenes, like 5 strips on a given day, and a day marker, and then another day and another day, in like 80 days that you're going to shoot the movie or whatever the schedule was. And Steven actually physically picked up the board in his hands and went, wah, 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 wah. He shook the board. It was very funny. Shook the board like that, and 2 days popped out. Ran 2 random days. And he grabbed the 2 days and he said, "Here are your 2 days. Next." Because he knew, he didn't care. He knew that it didn't matter, because once you start shooting, they can't stop you. There's no stopping.
No.
And so he just that's what I should have done. It's just the nature of movie making. Everybody's covering their butt and I should have, just sort of said, "Yeah, let's go. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out later." We'll get in trouble later. It's be too late. At least we're making the movie.
Yeah.
So, it was part of movie making.
Oh yeah, yeah. So what was your perception of the script for Jedi? Because it had quite a lot to accomplish in terms of finishing off the original trilogy, and I suppose there's some controversial elements there with the second Death Star and the Ewoks that I think divide opinion a little bit. What did you think of it?
Well, Jedi's not my favorite movie of the 3. It's my favorite is Empire, and my second is Star Wars, and my third is Jedi. And I think that I think they tried to do a good job of, wrapping the story up, revealing the relationship that Luke and Leia were brother and sister. Then, telling Leia that Vader's her father, tying Lando in, unfreezing Han Solo, the whole Ewok adventure, I think plays really well with little children. But to me was the thing I felt a little bit about Jedi is that, we were, and from a producing point of view, and this is, George was the producer and it was his money, and at this point he knew what he was doing, was that, we were making movies and selling toys.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of toy selling going on behind the making of the movie. And so I wasn't crazy about all of that. I love the Ewok stuff, but I think we were a little bit too long in that particular sequence, but that was, the nature of what we were doing. But I thought, the locations were great, and I was instrumental in helping find those locations. And, and I loved, the desert sequence.
Yeah.
And loved the, redwood stuff. I just thought, just beautiful, beautiful locations that we were able to shoot on. But I wasn't too crazy about the ending of the movie. The big, all the celebrations happening everywhere, and that happened in the later ones. But the big, dancing party up in the trees.
Yeah.
I kind of, not my favorite, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I think the script wasn't as good as the other scripts were.
Yeah.
But that's just a personal opinion. But still good movies. I still, I haven't seen Jedi lately. I did read a synopsis of it just to refresh my memory this morning before our phone call, because I hadn't seen it in a long time.
Yeah.
And I said, gee, what happens in this movie? I kind of forget. Yoda dies and Vader dies, and there's a lot of death going on. So it's also interesting. I also thought that Mark's character changed a bit in this movie. If you kind of track Luke's character from Star Wars, where he's a farm boy, to Empire, where he's kind of a little bit more golly gee, becoming a man, to Jedi, where he kind of becomes a little, oddly, Shakespearean. He kind of like loses a little bit of his boyhood wonder. And I was, I didn't think that worked out too well. It didn't really play for me in that sense, but
yeah.
But I guess that they were, George was happy with it. And, Mark sort of took on that kind of, more mature Jedi persona.
Yeah.
At that point.
I mean, how do you feel of Luke Skywalker's journey in the sequels then, in terms of, the sequel trilogy, and is that?
I have to watch the movies again to really give you a good critique on that. I just kind of watched them as a fan. I really have to kind of watch them again and put an eye to it. To me, watching all of the sequels and prequels it's funny. It used to be like going to a high school reunion for me. It's like, oh, I know these worlds, I know these characters, and so it was just like, going back and visiting old friends again, seeing Carrie and Han and, Luke and all of that stuff. But, I think that my J.J. Abrams movie was my favorite, although it was pretty much a rehash of Star Wars in a way. And, but some of the movies, it's been a while and I'd have to go back and watch them again. I wasn't, as I was very intimate with Empire and Jedi because I worked on them.
Yeah.
I knew every scene, every shot, everything that we were doing, every character, every, piece of wardrobe, location, but the other ones I was just, a moviegoer, going back to visit people again. And I never really put I never needed to put a critical eye to, okay, what's happened to Luke, what's going on with, with Leia now and all of that stuff. I did love Daisy Ridley. I thought was great. I just thought that she was brilliant. I just brilliant. She was great. I wasn't, too crazy about all the supporting characters in them.
Well, I thought John Boyega,
those supporting stories too.
Yeah, I thought John Boyega was very good
yes, he was very good. Yeah, he was very good. But anyway, I mean, I could critique all the other ones, but like who cares?
I mean, you were saying that at the time of Empire and Jedi, George Lucas was talking about his idea for the other two trilogies, including episode 7, 8, and 9.
Yes.
When you saw the actual 7, 8, and 9, was there things you thought, this is reminiscent to what George had in mind, or no, it's completely different to what he would have done?
I think it must have turned out to be what he wanted to do, because we didn't talk a lot about particular stories, except that, not so much about 7, 8, and 9, but more like 1, 2, and 3. I guess, well, 7, 8, and 9 or I'm trying to remember them all. The prequels was the story of all of them as young people. The story of, Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader and all of that. But really, Philip, I'd have to go watch them again.
Oh yeah.
And as far as 7, 8, and 9, well, really 1, 2, and 3 are the prequels to everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah. 7, 8, and 9 are the recent ones. I think George was out of 7, 8, and 9 at that point, so it's really hard to sort of say whether those were his movies per se. I know that when 7 came out, he didn't like it.
Right, okay.
And people had to say, don't say anything.
Yeah.
Because he could have, severely hurt the sort of the pre-publicity for the movie.
Yeah.
They weren't his movies. He had sort of really removed himself from the process at that point.
I think
because Kathy kind of took over Kathy Kennedy took over Lucasfilm, and they made these different movies.
Yeah, I think it probably must have been quite hard, given it is Star Wars is his baby, to sort of suddenly see somebody else in control. So that must have been quite difficult, really.
Well, people joke and say the $5 billion he got from Disney probably softened the landing a little bit,
I would probably say, yes.
It's like, oh well, it's one of those things.
Yeah, I think it helps a little bit. Yeah.
I would think so too, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I believe that. Could you tell us the story of how Blue Harvest came about?
Yeah, I'd be happy. I was just looking at that this morning. It was funny. Yeah, Blue Harvest was my idea, and I read this thing in Wikipedia where Howard took credit for it, and it's like, sorry, not true. When we were making Jedi, it became very apparent to me when we were out scouting locations, and everywhere else, that if we tell people we were making the next Star Wars sequel, the prices would triple everywhere we went. It's like you go somewhere and it's like, well, what are you doing? We're making a Star Wars sequel, and all of a sudden you can see the dollar signs going, wah, 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 the little cash registers in everybody's eyes.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to Howard and George, I want to change the name of the movie, during production. Otherwise, it's going to cost us a lot more money. We're just going to get killed. And they go, okay. And then I was just trying to think of a really boring title. It's like, and I came up with, Blue Harvest. And it's like, well, what is that? And it's like horror beyond imagination. The idea would be we're making a horror movie, but with a title that is like yawn, yawn, yawn. It's like, well, what is Blue Harvest? It's like, I don't know. What is it? It's like just dull. It's just nothing about it. The idea was that there would be nothing about it that would be inspiring. It's like, well, that's a stupid name for a movie. And it's like, yeah, it is a stupid name for a movie. That's why we came up with it. And then the horror beyond imagination was that because we wanted people to think it was a lower budget horror movie, not the next Star Wars movie. So that's where the title came from. And I, after we, came up with the title, we printed hats and we printed T-shirts, that people could wear. And it funny, the movie was so popular, and then it became a very big thing in the fandom. I think I still have a Blue Harvest T-shirt and a Blue Harvest hat, somewhere in my memorabilia collection somewhere. But that's really the story. It was that we need to kind of hide who we are. And the other problem was also at that time was that the fan base had grown. And we would have been, deluged by fans everywhere and people going through our garbage and people, that's what was happening is that fans would go through garbage cans, looking for pieces of paper, props or throwaway things and, all that sort of stuff. So we needed to keep a very low profile.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was how we did it with a really dumb name,
Good idea.
that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And then years later, I know that I'm forgetting his name, the Family Guy creator director Seth MacFarlane did he did this Blue Harvest TV show and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, those were brilliant. But the Family Guy Star Wars,
Right.
you can tell the love and the respect that they have for them. It's just so many of the shots, mirror images of very much. I want to talk about some of the wonderful creatures that Phil Tippett contributed, particularly Jabba the Hutt in Jedi.
Right. Oh well, George we put it to Phil to create a bunch of creatures that he could use and that he could inhabit in Jabba's palace. And when it comes to creatures, there's nobody better than Phil. He's Mr. Creature. He's got this. Phil's got a new stop motion style movie out that I'm trying to remember the name of that you can see on YouTube. That he's been working on for a million years. It's I haven't seen it. I've only seen a trailer of it and I've heard about it. But if you Google Phil and it's like monsters or something with monsters and God in the title. Maybe if some of your people are watching, they can go online and look it up. And he's worked on it for many, many years. But when Phil was, of course, did all the great work on, the 3D chess scene on Star Wars with all this, stop frame animation and the Tauntaun stuff. And, was helpful with all the Snow Walker pieces, during the Hoth sequence. And when we can, and some of the other creatures as well. So on Jedi, he did Sarlacc pit monster stuff and the Rancor pit monster and came up with all those, great creatures that you see, the puppets and also, the guards and all those other creatures in Jabba's palace. Oh, and Phil did all the great masks in the cantina scene in Star Wars.
Oh yeah, yeah.
All of that beautiful work too. So we when we made Jedi, we set up this huge creature shop, adjunct to ILM, sort of in the same building vicinity and facilities and whatnot, and hired these great mask makers. Yeah. People who Phil had worked with for many years and brought them all up from LA and working with the costume designer Aggie Rogers and her associate Nilo Rodis, they came up with all these wonderful creatures to inhabit Jabba's palace and Jabba himself. I think although Phil designed Jabba, Jabba was built and created and a puppeteered by Stuart Freeborn over, if I'm remembering, over in the UK. Stuart was designed Yoda and helped with the puppeting of that and creating it for Frank Oz to use on Empire and then again on Jedi. Did you? I don't hear you. Did you lose me again? Can you hear me?
I lost you for a second, Jamie. You just started to mention Stuart Freeborn and Jabba, and then I lost you.
Yeah, Stuart. I think Stuart created, from one of Phil's designs, he created Jabba. And helped articulate him, through different puppeteers for, movements of hands and body and eyes and tails and, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, Jabba was a great character. Jabba is one of the great characters.
Yeah. I mean, what were the some of the technicalities in filming out in the desert for the barge sequences and the Sarlacc pit in the desert? Was it filming in a desert difficult?
Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't particularly that it was difficult. it wasn't too bad because we shot in the early spring. So when we went scouting locations there a year before, we looked all over the Southwest United States to find that location because it was like no vegetation. That was like the calling card. No trees, no greenery, and we had Robert Watts and I and Norman Reynolds, who was the production designer, took this wonderful reconnaissance location trip looking for locations. And it took us through Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. And the last place we wound up was down in Yuma, and Yuma was perfect because it was just sand dunes everywhere. And it was wonderful. But we were there in the summertime, and I remember scouting in the summer, and it was 120 degrees. It was outrageous. It was like being in a sauna, but it was a beautiful looking location. So we went in and we built Jabba's barge, and that little dune piece sort of extended to it where the Sarlacc pit was, with the barges kind of floating over it. It was the largest outdoor set that had ever been built by a motion picture ever.
Wow.
It would nowadays you would never do that. It would all be miniatures and paintings and all sorts of stuff. But we built the whole thing because it was all so interconnected, and there were all these gags of people jumping off the barge and people from the skiffs falling into the pit and all this stuff going on. So it was really quite an amazing build. I think it took us about 6 months to build that set down there. So it was really quite remarkable, and to see it out in the middle of these sand dunes, it was it was really quite an operation. We were about 20 minutes outside of Yuma, in California, in an area called Buttercup Valley. And one of the things that we kind of needed to avoid, it was owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and it's a huge RV area. People would come and go four-wheel sand buggy, driving all over the place, on weekends, and big sort of events and festivals like over Easter weekend and stuff. But we avoided all that. I think we probably started shooting in like mid-April or something. And anyway, it was big security operation. And, it was quite a big deal. It was kind of hard to maneuver around and move around, set up camera platforms and stuff. But it worked out. It all worked out. I think the sequence plays pretty well on the screen.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic.
It looks real because it sort of is real. And I remember when we were all done shooting, the special effects guys wanted to blow up the barge. Let's blow it up. I went, no, we're not going to blow it up. Oh, let's blow it up. Let's just blow it up. The thing about live action special effects guys is, oftentimes when you meet these guys, you say hi to them and they all have hands that look like this.
Yeah.
They're all missing a finger because it's been blown away in some gag or explosion or something, And they just wanted to blow that puppy up. And it was like, forget it. Ecologically, it would have been a disaster. And we had all of this, who's going to clean up the mess when it's gone? We couldn't leave it there. And, it was like, no, we're not going to blow it up. We're going to sell it to somebody, and they're just going to come in and take it all. It's all still good lumber. Blowing it up just would have been a huge mess.
But I think over the years, the Star Wars fans would probably have gone to the desert and picked it all up. But
they had we blown it up, they would have picked up a lot of charred lumber. You can imagine all the smoke it would have put in the air, and it just sounded like a public relations nightmare to me.
Oh yeah, I think you made the right call there. Yeah.
A producer do. A producer tries to make a good decision about what not to do sometimes, as opposed to what to do. No, we're not going to blow the set up. We're going to tear it apart and recycle the lumber.
I wanted to mention the film's director, Richard Marquand.
Yes.
Again, much like Erwin Kershner, coming from a more dramatic background, what was the relationship with him and George like?
I think they had a very good relationship. I remember being in a screening before we met Richard. We were in London, and we went to go see a movie that Richard had directed called Eye of the Needle. that he had made with Donald Sutherland, and everybody was very impressed by the quality of the movie making. And I think that's what sold George in particular on working with Richard and meeting him to direct the movie. And Richard was a very accommodating director. I think it was very difficult for him because, he was like being thrown into George's world. And,
Yeah.
and he didn't know a lot about visual effects or about ILM or how the movies were made in that sense. So he really relied a lot on George to guide him and help him along. Very different director than Kirshner. Kirshner was a real filmmaker. Not that Richard wasn't, but Kirshner was far more experienced and, as far as working with actors and making big movies and stuff like that. And Richard hadn't directed a lot of features. But I think that, all in all, it worked out well, and it was fine. And when necessary, George was around to help, and other times he wasn't, when it wasn't necessary, and Richard would take over. So, but it was a different picture.
But George quite happily come and help in. He didn't feel like it was, he can't do it himself sort of thing. It was very much sort of creative, giving, relationship. And
I think, I do. I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Because he did sadly pass away quite young, didn't he, Richard? I think he was he passed away in 87, I think, if I've got my dates right. He had a stroke, unfortunately.
Yeah, very, very sad. Yeah, he passed away. Really a shame.
49 he was, just 49.
49. Yeah, really a shame. A dad with young children and stuff, and
Yeah. But,
I liked Richard. He was a very nice man.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly the dramatic moments, much like Irving Kershner, really play very well under his direction.
Yes.
Tell how good he is.
Yeah, I think he had the respect of the actors.
You mentioned they're shooting in the forest for the Endor sequences.
Yes.
What were the complexities of that? I suppose the heat and the costumes and things like that might be difficult.
Well, the forest was nice. The difficulty with the forest was sort of like more getting around the forest. The difficulty of finding the location was that there aren't a lot of redwoods left in the state of California. At least the really big primary old growth redwoods.
Yeah.
And one of the associate producers was a woman named Mickey Herman. She knew every patch of redwoods from Santa Cruz up to the Oregon border. And we used to go helicopter scouting, looking for patches of redwoods. And a lot of it had to do with proximity. And it just turned out that there was this curtain of redwoods that a lumber company owned between the highway, which was Highway 101 that runs up from Eureka up to the Oregon border outside of Crescent City. And they left the curtain up because they had clear cut behind it. And so there was this swatch of old growth redwoods that was absolutely incredible, just remarkable, that people hadn't walked in it for thousands of years. But it was only maybe about a half mile wide, or maybe 3/4 of a mile wide. On one side was the freeway, and on the other side was clear cut. But what the lumber company did was because they didn't want people to see the clear cut because it's just so ugly and disgusting, and these trees are just so magnificent, they left this stand of redwoods, and we couldn't shoot in the national parks or the state parks because they didn't want us coming in and tromping over everything and putting explosions in the trees and all of that stuff. So we got lucky to work out this deal with what was the Miller-Relum Lumber Company. I don't even know if they're still around anymore. And we went in, and I remember my early location scouts, with people into this swath of redwoods. And it was like you would walk into a prehistoric forest, and you would go down, and the ferns would be up to here, and you would sink into this soft leaf, mossy ground. Like you would take a step and you sponge down, about a half foot to a foot down as you walked around this old primeval forest. And the trees were just just absolutely, I mean, just stunning, just how huge and old and big. And I mean, these redwood trees are just so majestic. They're really quite amazing. So anyway, that was the location that we found, and it worked out very well because there were logging roads, and they didn't have a problem with us, bringing other roads down. All the trees were eventually going to be logged. And then a couple of years later, really a shame because these trees are just so magnificent. These old redwood trees are just wild. I just got a sign that my internet connections. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah. Occasionally you're freezing, but we seem to be okay. It's not lasting too long.
The only difficult part was that we had the largest collection of little people since the Wizard of Oz.
Yes.
Who were dressed up in the Ewok costumes, and the poor little people, after 2 or 3 weeks of first unit and second unit wearing these really heavy furry, the costumes got so stinky. It was just such a chore for these little people to jump into the costumes every day. But it was really quite a collection of people.
Yeah.
And years later, I would still run into little people, who would say, "Oh yeah, I was up on Jedi. I was one of the Ewoks and stuff." And it was really pretty wild. Star Wars characters and all these little teddy bears running around the forest.
Yeah, I think they work very well as characters. I think because I think they're originally going to be a Wookiee planet, but I suppose
right.
it was better to have them as more cute and furry creatures that you wouldn't think could necessarily take on, the Empire, but it's done in a realistic way that you think that they could overcome that kind of. So I think it worked quite nicely with it. I could see what mind. Yeah.
Logs and tripwires and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah. So what were some of your favorite memories of Jedi that perhaps we haven't already touched upon?
Favorite moments of
favorite memories of working on Jedi?
My favorite memories of working on Jedi was scouting the locations. That was great fun. Going out and looking for the locations and seeing all these different places and looking at all the woods and looking at all the deserts and all of those things.
Yes.
That was that. Trying to remember of other favorite. Yeah, it was mostly that. It's all usually early on when you're doing the concept work, and working with Ralph. That was always fun and interesting when you get to sort of see starting to take shape and come together visually and whatnot. I enjoyed being on location. Really quite beautiful up there. So that was quite nice. And we were also staying at a location right along a river that ran through the redwoods and then out to the Pacific Ocean, and a place called Smith River. That was like aside from actually making the movie. But that was very pleasant. It was very, very pleasant being up in the woods. I mean, the thing that's remarkable, we used to, when we went location scouting, is that being in California, it's one of the few places where we used to joke that we could start the morning in San Francisco and fly in a private jet, that George had rented to Yuma, Arizona. So I can't do the centigrade equivalent very well, but you'd start the morning and it would be 60 degrees in San Francisco. You'd spend midday in Yuma where it was 120. And you'd wind up in the redwoods where it was in the high 40s, in Fahrenheit. So it's like this California is just such a remarkable state, where you can go from like extreme desert that looks like Tunisia up to the redwood forests of Northern California, in the course of one day. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
So those kind of experiences were something. That was pretty great to be able to do that.
You mentioned working with Ralph and the concept, artwork and things like that. Did Ralph walk away from Return of the Jedi just because it was a bit too much workload wise, or do you sort of burn out on that, or was,
I think he was getting kind of burnt out. He wanted
mm,
to like step away a little bit.
yeah,
I think that was part of it, that he had done quite a bit.
mm,
But I don't remember exactly.
mm,
But yeah, I'd have to go back and reread some stuff about all that.
mm,
Ralph and I were pretty close. We
mm,
knew each other quite well.
yeah,
But I think I remember him saying, "I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore." And me having conversations with him to say, well, to encourage him to stay in there. And his work was just so brilliant.
yeah.
He's such a talented artist.
Mm. I suppose the films are so demanding that
Yes,
after a while, someone's got to give, isn't it? I imagine, and there's
right.
getting more visual effect shots in Jedi compared to Empire, and it just always
Yeah,
seems larger and
each,
larger.
each of the movies kind of grew exponentially in the challenges of the visual effects and the work that was being done.
Mm. Mm.
That's very true.
Yeah.
I think the biggest jump was probably from Star Wars to Empire, and then probably not as big of a jump from Empire to Jedi
Mm. Yeah.
that I recall, because I think there was probably less space work, and we weren't, a lot of the equipment that was built on Empire to accommodate the work as far as cameras and optical printers had all been done.
Mm.
And the facility had been set up and more finely oiled and tuned in order to get the work out and through the pipeline.
Mm.
So I don't think it was as demanding, and it was a different kind of spirit in the making of the movie.
So it's a bit easier
Well,
film.
yeah, not that it was like, it'd be more kind of, between Star Wars and Empire, there was this great spirit that I tried to instill in people, which was that we're going to make the sequel better than the original.
Yeah.
It's not just going to be another sequel.
Mm.
And I think that by the time Jedi came around, it was like, well, it's another sequel.
Yeah.
It was hard to kind of instill that same spirit again. Like, okay, let's make this one even better than the next one.
Mm.
But it was a different story because it wasn't as dramatic as Empire was. And Empire is like the middle story in the trilogy, which is always the one that, you get the up of the first one and the down of the second, and then the up of the third. And the down of the second is where you tend to have the most dramatic conflict between your characters,
Mm.
and leave them hanging, waiting for whatever the third story is going to be.
Mm.
And then the third story is the one where you kind of need to kind of go in and like tie all your bows up very neatly,
Yeah.
and leave everybody, dancing and singing in the Ewok forest at the end of the movie,
Mm.
which I, wasn't,
Yeah.
whatever.
What was the biggest challenge from your perspective on Jedi?
The biggest challenge? I don't know. I think one of the biggest challenges that I had on Jedi is that I had to make the movie with technicians who were from San Francisco and not Los Angeles.
Hmm.
The West Coast movie business is in LA, and because we weren't signed with the unions in LA, I had to work with San Francisco crews who are not as experienced as LA crews in movie making, because they're just, they just aren't. It's a smaller labor pool to draw from.
Yeah.
And that was a really big challenge, and working out all of the labor problems, with the camera department, transportation department, other union technicians, the lighting people, the grips, the prop people, all of that sort of stuff. That was, working out those labor issues and bringing them all together was really the biggest challenge I had on Jedi. And it's a producing challenge. It was a business challenge, more than it was anything else, working because it wasn't possible for me to draw on oftentimes the best talent that I could find in Los Angeles. And then when I did bring people in from Los Angeles, I had to insist that they had to limit the number of people that they could also bring up from LA to work on the movie.
Yeah.
So that was kind of complicated. And then there was the integration of the British crew with the US crew, and what people were coming over, and, who was coming and who wasn't, and how to integrate the two crews together. when the live action shooting in London was done, and the unit moved over to Arizona, and then from Arizona up to up to Northern California.
Hmm. And what are some of your memories of the main cast? So Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill. You'd worked on a number of films with both of those.
It was nothing in particular. I kind of knew everybody by then, so it was a little different because we were in the United States and we weren't isolated. It wasn't quite like on Empire when we were all in Norway together in a single hotel with nowhere to go because there's too much snow outside and it's too cold and you can't go out for dinner, and you're like all contained in this one group. So it was kind of a little bit more of like normal filmmaking in a sense. So nothing stood out too much about Mark and Carrie and Harrison and Billy D and Anthony and all the characters.
If I have to mention it because it's a big fan moment, but what did Carrie Fisher think of her gold bikini Jabba stage girl?
And I think she's a trooper. She's an actor. She just put it on, and she knew it was kind of part of the sequence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all kind of oddly erotic and sexual in retrospect. But I didn't think we all thought too much about it at the time. Other than Carrie's really cute. She looked great. Yeah. She wore it beautifully.
Because it seems quite an adult thing to have in retrospect for a Star Wars film, but it's not overly done, and it's not it works well in the film.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean it's a wonderful scene where she strangles Jabba with the chain.
Yeah,
like that's great. Jabba gets his comeuppance. He's such a slimy character.
Yes.
Yeah, they did a great job with Joe.
Yeah.
I love Jabba. He's such a great character. He's a wonderful character.
Didn't they base him on Sydney Greenstreet loosely? The character.
That may be. I don't know. I don't know about that. I would have to ask Phil that question.
Yeah, it's brilliant character.
Yeah, it's a great character. And, yeah, it's like to these days, if you want to, pay somebody a left-handed compliment in the morning, you say, "Oh, you look a little bit like Jabba this morning."
I'm not even sure if that's even left-handed, but yeah.
I wouldn't, try it on your wife sometime, Philip. See where it gets you. Not too far, probably. Except maybe a night on the couch, perhaps. Huh?
Probably, yes.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, did you think that the Mark and Harrison Ford were happy with the way the characters were going, and as the trilogy went on, do you think they were happy with the stuff they were given?
You mean in the later trilogies?
Well, I suppose from how their stories were resolved in Jedi.
Jedi?
Yeah.
I think so. I think I guess I don't know. It's a good question. I didn't get much of a sense of that, any of that. So it's mostly just a lot of action stuff.
Yeah.
In Jedi, there's not a whole lot of more character stuff between Mark and Vader, and Mark and the Emperor, Luke and the Emperor, and less between with the threesome, because they're not all together during the whole movie. They're all kind of off in different directions all the time. Because Luke goes off to Dagobah to be with Yoda, who dies, and then he goes to be the Emperor, and Harrison's on the planet, and Billy D's up in space, and there are all these different interweaving stories going on.
Because I believe Harrison Ford initially wanted Solo to die in the film. I think he felt that that might be a good resolution for his character. Right. But I think the story I heard was that George Lucas thought, well, I can't sell a dead Han Solo action figure, so we can't kill him off in this kind of film. But
it sounds like exactly something George would say.
Said that.
It's a very good point.
but of course, Harrison got his wish in The Force Awakens and
Right.
had quite a nice death scene in that. So
Yeah.
but,
Yeah, getting killed by his son, huh?
yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite sort of
Right.
Shakespearean tragedy,
Sure.
Sophocles, that sort of area really. But
So I think I'd like to wrap this up if we could. Is that
yeah. I was just about to do that really.
right?
So I was just going to say, so after Jedi, you were you've got a few film credits that I could find on IMDb, producing credits, but it seems like your career then went into a different direction. What were you thinking after Jedi, and what did you then do?
I worked. I produced and executive produced a few movies.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a good deal of time working with Barwood and Robbins on this one movie that we didn't make, and then we made Warning Sign.
Mm-hmm.
And then after Warning Sign, worked on the nature of being a producer, you work on movies that don't get made. There were, any number of movies that I tried to get made that didn't happen. Then I worked with, I forgot, with Gillian Armstrong, a really wonderful Australian director, on a movie called Fires Within. And after that, I went to work at, got a job working at Sony Pictures in a group that, this is back in the early 90s. It was called the New Technologies Group, which is funny because it's like not new technology anymore. But we were making interactive movies with Laserdisc technology, which is very interesting. And I was running that division. And we were also making IMAX 3D movies.
Right.
And I got to work with a director who I didn't talk about before, who I really, like very much. He was a director named Jean-Jacques Hano. And we made an IMAX 3D movie back in the time when IMAX 3D movies were really 3D movies.
Yeah.
Shooting with two 65mm cameras with a beam splitting mirror. And you would go into these big IMAX theaters that Sony was building at the time, where you had this great headset that you wore with 3D sound in the headset and interweaving polarized lenses on it, so you could really get a 3D experience. And what was great about working with Jean-Jacques is that he's a very adventurous filmmaker, and what he loved about the 3D was, well, how can we tell a 3D story where we really take advantage of the technology? And so he made a movie called Wings of Courage, which is about the early days of the Aeropostale flying in South America, and a particular pilot who would fly from Santiago to Rio across the Andes, and his plane went down in the mountains, and he had to walk out. And so it was just great for 3D, because you're flying in 3D is just amazing. And the movie was remarkable. It was just a beautiful movie. And then what Sony was trying to do at the time is that they were launching all of these kind of retail theater real estate developments, where you would have a motion picture, and then you would have stores and restaurants and up and coming technology type things like movie rides and other stuff. This is 92, 93, stuff like that. So I stayed there for a few years, and then I was offered to go to work at Electronic Arts, the game company.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to work at EA for about, went to work at EA for about a year. They were trying to launch an EA TV division, which never happened. And I left with one of the guys who I went to EA to work for, and we started a video game company. And the idea was to try and bring the best of Hollywood with the best of interactivity. And we had backing from Kleiner Perkins and a couple of other of the really big venture capital groups in Silicon Valley, but it didn't quite work out. But we were doing some really interesting stuff with interactive storytelling, because we were working with Neil Stevenson, the science fiction writer, on one project, and working with some other Hollywood directors on a few other projects. But unfortunately, the venture capitalists didn't have the patience to let us do some interesting stuff, and we released a really crappy game. And I could see the writing was on the wall, that it wasn't going in the right direction, and I left in like 97 or so, and I went back to working on movies. And then a year later went to work with Phil Tippett at Tippett Studio.
Yeah,
and stayed with Phil, helping him grow the studio from like 50 people to 200 and 1 movie a year to 8 movies a year. And I had visions of for Phil becoming a director, trying to do at what we had done at ILM with George and Lucasfilm movies, to have Tippett do that with Tippett as a director. But anyway, we worked on 2 of the Matrix movies, worked on a lot of great movies, Guillermo del Toro movies, and really sort of matured the Tippett studio into a world-class visual effects facility. And I stayed there for about 6 or 7 years and then left, and went back to working. Didn't work on too many movies after that, and then retired a few years later. And that's that's about the story of it.
And you enjoy your retirement? And
oh yeah. I produced a very low budget movie about 5 years ago. A guy said to me, I want you to produce this movie for me. And I said, okay. I'd never made $1 million movie before. And we made a movie it's a very nice movie. It's called Pushing Dead. And it's a kind of a dark comedy about a late 30-year-old man with HIV, living his life with HIV and wanting to fall in love again. And it's a very touching kind of comedic story. And it did very well at the film festivals, but never got a broader release, unfortunately. I wasn't really around for that part of the movie. I was just there mostly for the production part. It's directed by a man named Tom Brown, and it starred Danny Glover.
Oh yes.
And I'm trying to forget some of the other actresses. Robin, I'm going to forget them all right now. They'll come to me later. Anyway, but Danny was in it. And another young actor, James, I'm forgetting his name, I'm sorry. He's the star of a TV show on one of the channels now.
I just having a look at on IMDb. Yeah, Danny Glover, Tom Riley, Robin Wiegert.
Robin Wiegert, yep.
James Rodriguez.
Oh yeah, James Roday.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, he played the lead. Yeah, it's a very good movie. You can rent it on Amazon. It's a nice film.
Yeah, I'm sure
they did a good job. Very, very good production values. It doesn't, it looks like a $4 or $5 million movie, not $1 million movie.
Is it nicer to work on these smaller films compared to, say, the big ones? Was it a bit more intimate?
Yeah, it is. It is nicer sometimes, because you're not dealing with, hundreds of extras and people and costumes and Ewoks and visual effects and huge budgets and monster locations. And, it's nice to tell more intimate stories about things. That's very enjoyable. But you still try to bring some of your experience in movie making to bear. Hope it pays off. So yeah, Pushing Dead's a nice movie.
Oh yeah, I'm sure everybody that's watching this either live or on YouTube or look up your films, and I particularly like to watching your stuff. So
if you see it, drop me a note. But you have to go see Warning Sign, Philip. Go watch Warning Sign.
That does sound really good, actually. Yes.
Warning Sign's a lot of fun. Yeah, it's a lot of fun because after having talked about it, you'll appreciate it. Turn up the sound, crank up the sound. Alan Splett was a brilliant sound designer. You can really sort of experience how good it was.
Yeah, be sure to check that out. So, well, thanks very much, Jim, for a wonderful conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank your guests for good questions.
Will do. Yeah.
I appreciate that, and you let me know when you want to have me back again.
Yeah, I'll be delighted. Yes.
If you want to talk about another picture, like if you want to talk about Body Snatchers or Close Encounters, or
I'm sure I could be tempted. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be fine. Great. Yeah. And thanks to all your guys.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Jim for sharing your wonderful experiences, and it was great fun.
My pleasure. Cheers to all of you, and stay healthy, stay well.
You too. Take care.
Enjoy your lives, guys. Talk to you later. Okay.
You too, Jim. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Philip. You too.
Yeah. Bye.
Here's, I'll click the button here.
Okay.
Okay.
So yes, I just want to say thank you to everybody joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. For those who might be interested, got a couple more events coming up. Got a couple of James Bond events, and some vintage TV ones, or cult TV. So they've got Persuaders, a couple of the Avengers, Patrick McNee coming up. So hopefully you guys can join us for some of those. So have a lovely weekend and take care. Bye.